My name is Sarah, and I'm 32 years old. 4 hours ago, my 5-year-old son stopped breathing on my living room floor because my mother-in-law secretly folded peanut butter into his slice of Christmas cake. She did it to prove his severe allergy was just a fabricated parenting trend. Now she is sitting in the brightly lit waiting room of Memorial Hospital, crying into her tailored coat and telling the emergency room doctor that the local bakery must have cross-contaminated the batter. She is putting on a flawless performance. My husband is rubbing her shoulders, telling her it is not her fault. She looks past his arm, catches my eye, and gives a small, calculated smirk. She thinks she has won. She thinks she just exposed me as a dramatic and overprotective mother in front of my own husband. What she does not know is that I have a motion-activated camera hidden behind the cookbooks in her kitchen. Before I tell you exactly how that tiny lens secured a restraining order and dismantled her pristine suburban life, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Sweet Life Drama. Drop your age, your location, and the local time in the comments below. I read every single one. Now, let me take you back to the moment the ambulance doors finally closed. The hospital waiting room smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. I sat on a hard plastic chair with my hands resting on my knees. I did not cry. I did not yell. I just watched. My son Leo was in the next room with an IV in his small arm, recovering from a dose of epinephrine that saved his life. Evelyn paced the linoleum floor. She wiped her dry eyes with a tissue. She told my husband Mark that I must have let Leo eat unwashed fruit or candy from the floorboards of my car. She said she specifically ordered the cake from a nut-free facility. She leaned her weight against Mark, playing the frail grandmother traumatized by a sudden medical emergency. Mark fell for it. He always falls for it. He looked at me with tired eyes and asked if I was sure I had not fed Leo anything strange on the drive over. He wanted me to comfort his mother. He wanted me to bridge the gap and apologize for glaring at her. He wanted to keep the peace. I remained silent. I felt the cold plastic of my phone in my pocket. My mind was busy processing the digital file I had just watched while standing in the hallway. 7 days earlier, Mark suggested we monitor our new part-time sitter. He bought a small camera. I placed it among the potted plants in our kitchen. When we visited Evelyn for the weekend, I brought the device along to monitor the playroom, eventually leaving it on the kitchen counter. While Evelyn wept for the doctors, I had opened the cloud storage application. I scrolled back to the timestamp matching the dinner preparation. I watched her stand alone at her marble island. I watched her unscrew a plastic jar. I watched her scoop out a thick spoonful of peanut butter and deliberately mix it into the bottom layer of a specific slice of cake. The corner piece, the piece she always saves for Leo. She did not know the device was silently recording her actions in high definition. I am a financial auditor. I spend my days finding discrepancies people try to hide in plain sight. I do not argue with fake tears. I argue with data. Sitting in that hospital chair, watching her smirk, I knew the dynamic of our family was about to change permanently. To understand how we ended up in a sterile hospital waiting room on Christmas night, you have to understand the 5 years of quiet warfare that preceded it. The peanut butter in the cake was not a sudden act of madness. It was the terrifying moment Evelyn finally dropped her mask and crossed the line from passive aggression into calculated physical violence. For half a decade, Evelyn was a woman who communicated her disdain entirely through subtle slights and imported goods. She lives in a sprawling 5-bedroom colonial house in a gated suburb. Her kitchen shelves are lined with hand-painted French ceramics she never uses for actual cooking. I grew up in a narrow duplex on the other side of the state line. My father worked swing shifts at the Municipal Transit Authority, and my mother managed a local dry cleaner. We measured success in paid-off utility bills, not country club memberships. From the moment I stepped onto Evelyn's pristine hardwood floors, wearing a pair of practical winter boots, she decided I was a calculated opportunist. She never said the words gold digger out loud. She did not have to. She showed it by consistently asking if my family could afford the gas to drive out for visits. She showed it by gifting me self-help books on basic financial literacy for my birthdays, despite the fact that I hold a master's degree in accounting. I swallowed those insults. I smiled politely and sent prompt thank you notes. I did this because Mark asked me to. Mark is a good man in many ways, but he suffers from a crippling fear of his mother's disapproval. Whenever Evelyn crossed a line, Mark would pull me aside, rub the back of his neck, and ask me to take the high road. He would say she is from a different generation and that it is easier to just let her have her way. That strategy of surrender might work for rude comments about my wardrobe. It does not work for medical science. 2 years ago, when Leo turned 3, he had his first allergic reaction after sharing a snack with a child at a community playground. The local clinic sent us straight to a pediatric allergist. The doctor sat us down in a bright primary-colored office and explained the gravity of the situation. Leo possessed a Class 6 peanut allergy. The doctor handed us 2 epinephrine auto-injectors and told us that a single misstep could result in a fatal anaphylactic event. We drove straight to Evelyn's house to explain the new reality. We sat at her heavy oak dining table. I handed her the printed medical guidelines, highlighting the section on cross-contamination. Evelyn did not even look at the paper. She took a slow sip of her white wine, rolled her eyes, and slid the document back across the polished wood. She said children today are manufactured to be weak. She claimed that back in her day, kids played in the dirt, ate whatever was put in front of them, and grew up strong. She looked right at me and said food allergies were just a trendy millennial parenting tactic used to seek attention. I looked at Mark, waiting for him to defend our son. I waited for him to slam his hand on the table and demand respect for his child's safety. Instead, Mark looked down at his shoes. He offered a weak laugh and said the doctor was just being overly cautious, but that we still needed to follow the rules. He gave her an out. He validated her skepticism to avoid a confrontation. His concession became her permission. Over the next 2 years, Evelyn treated Leo's allergy as a personal challenge. She would forget to check labels on cookies she bought. She would suggest taking him to a Thai restaurant known for heavy peanut use, acting deeply offended when I vetoed the idea. Every time I intercepted a dangerous snack, she would sigh loudly and accuse me of being neurotic. And every time, Mark would pull me into the hallway and beg me to stop making a scene. Keeping the peace became a toxic mantra. I was expected to gamble with my son's life so Evelyn could enjoy her holiday dinners without reading an ingredient list. That toxic pattern reached its boiling point tonight. The Christmas dinner had been a grand production. Evelyn invited her 2 daughters, their husbands, and a handful of affluent neighbors. The dining room was loud with laughter and the clinking of crystal glasses. Then, the dessert arrived. Evelyn served Leo his piece of cake first. I watched my 5-year-old boy take a bite. He smiled. He took a second bite. Then, the fork slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the china plate. I looked across the table. Leo was scratching frantically at his neck. A violent, angry red rash was blooming across his pale skin, crawling up his jawline. His lips began to swell. He opened his mouth, but instead of a voice, a thin, high-pitched wheezing sound came out. He was drowning in the open air. I pushed my chair back so hard it crashed to the floor. I sprinted around the table and dropped to my knees beside him. His small hands were clawing at his throat. His eyes were wide and filled with a primal terror. I screamed for Mark to get the medical bag from the hallway. I looked up at Evelyn. She was still holding her silver cake server. She did not look frightened. She looked annoyed. She actually crossed her arms and said he was just working himself into a panic attack because I hovered over him too much. Mark froze. He stood halfway between the table and the door, staring at his gasping son, paralyzed by the sudden collapse of his perfect family dinner. I did not wait for him. I ran to the hallway, tore open my purse, and grabbed the yellow plastic tube. I ran back, pulled Leo's pant leg up, and drove the needle into his thigh. I held it there, counting the agonizing seconds out loud while the room dissolved into chaos. Guests were shouting, chairs were scraping, sirens wailed in the distance because a neighbor had the sense to dial emergency services while my husband stood frozen. The paramedics burst through the front door a few minutes later. They scooped Leo up, strapped an oxygen mask to his small face, and rushed him out into the freezing night air. I climbed into the back of the ambulance, holding his limp hand as the vehicle tore down the highway. That brings us back to this hospital waiting room. Mark is still rubbing Evelyn's shoulders. He is still trying to manage her emotions while our son lies in a hospital bed with monitors taped to his chest. Mark still thinks this was a terrible accident. He thinks the bakery made a mistake. He thinks his mother is a victim of circumstance. I reach into my pocket and trace the edge of my phone case. The video file is safely backed up to 2 different secure servers. I have the irrefutable proof that Evelyn intentionally bypassed a deadly allergy to win a petty psychological game. She gambled my son's breath for her own ego. As I watch her dab her dry eyes with the tissue, a cold, sharp clarity washes over me. The era of keeping the peace is over. I am going to let her continue this performance. I am going to let her tell her lies to the doctors, to Mark, and to her daughters. I am going to let her build her false narrative high into the sky. And then, tomorrow, I am going to burn it to the ground. The rhythmic hum of the pediatric monitoring equipment provided the only steady metric in a room heavy with exhaustion. Leo lay motionless on the narrow hospital cot. His skin held the pale, translucent quality of skim milk, a sharp contrast to the angry red welt still fading along his collarbone. A clear plastic tube delivered a slow, measured drip of saline and antihistamines into a vein near his wrist. I sat in the vinyl chair beside him. My hand rested lightly over his knee, feeling the shallow, reassuring rise and fall of his breathing. The crisis had passed, leaving behind a cold, clinical quiet. That quiet shattered the moment the heavy wooden door swung open. Evelyn stepped into the room. She had not ridden in the back of the ambulance. She had driven her luxury sport utility vehicle, taking the time to touch up her lipstick and ensure her tailored coat remained unwrinkled. The sharp click of her designer heels on the linoleum announced her arrival. She paused in the doorway, scanning the space to assess the audience. Seeing only Mark and me, she immediately launched into her rehearsed routine. She bypassed the bed entirely. She did not walk over to look at the small boy who had nearly lost his life under her roof. Instead, she gravitated straight toward Mark, who was standing by the window. She buried her face into his shoulder. Dry sobs racked her frame. She began to speak in a fragile, trembling voice, weaving a narrative designed to shield her from any accountability. She claimed the artisan bakery must have deceived her. She swore the counter staff assured her the facility maintained a strict allergy protocol. She painted herself as the heartbroken matriarch, betrayed by negligent hourly workers who did not respect the importance of a family holiday. Mark wrapped his arms around her, patting her back with the practiced rhythm of a lifelong pacifier. Mark grew up as an only son in a house where affection functioned as currency. Evelyn never gave love unconditionally. She distributed it based on compliance. If Mark mirrored her opinions, he received praise. If he dared to form an independent thought, she subjected him to weeks of freezing isolation. That childhood conditioning molded him into a man incapable of standing up to her. He would rather negotiate with a tyrant than face his mother's disappointment. Having secured her son's sympathy, Evelyn turned her attention toward me. The trembling victim act evaporated, replaced by a calculated pivot. The tactic is called deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. She looked at my wrinkled clothes and messy hair. She tilted her head, adopting a tone of false maternal concern that masked a very sharp blade. She asked if I was certain I had maintained a clean environment in my vehicle. She suggested, loud enough for the passing triage nurses to hear, that perhaps I had purchased an unsafe snack at a gas station earlier that afternoon. She crafted a story where her dining room was a pristine sanctuary and my chaotic, working-class parenting was the true hazard. She wanted to plant a seed of doubt. She needed someone else to hold the liability. The true heartbreak did not come from Evelyn. I expected venom from her. The true heartbreak came from the man wearing a gold band on his left hand. Mark pulled away from his mother and looked at me. His eyes pleaded with me to accept a fraction of the blame. He lowered his voice and asked the question that ended our marriage right there in the sterile fluorescent light. He asked if I might have handed Leo a granola bar from my purse. He asked if maybe I had made a simple mistake and forgotten to check a label in my rush to get to dinner. He wanted me to take the fall. He needed me to be the villain so his mother could remain the saint. He was willing to sacrifice my sanity to maintain his comfortable illusion of a perfect family. In the past, I might have argued. I might have defended my meticulous label reading and the strict protocols I follow to keep our son breathing. I might have cried out of sheer frustration. Evelyn wanted me to cry. She wanted me to raise my voice. A loud, emotional woman is easily dismissed as hysterical. She was baiting a trap, waiting for me to scream so she could point to my reaction as proof of my instability. But I am a financial auditor. I deal in ledgers. Ledgers do not have emotions. When an account does not balance, you do not yell at the spreadsheet. You simply gather the receipts. I stared at Mark. I let the silence stretch between us. I did not blink. I watched the discomfort crawl up his neck as my refusal to play along threw his script out of balance. My silence was a wall he did not know how to climb. Before Mark could find the words to fill the void, the attending physician walked in holding a digital tablet. The doctor asked for a detailed timeline of the exposure to determine the necessary observation period. This was the critical juncture. The doctor was a mandated reporter. If I accused Evelyn of intentional poisoning right then, without presenting the video evidence, it would devolve into a screaming match. The hospital protocol would trigger an immediate call to Child Protective Services. Leo could be held in state custody while they investigated a severe case of suspected domestic child endangerment. I could not risk my son being trapped in the system. I had to play the long game. I sat back in my chair, folded my hands in my lap, and gestured for Evelyn to answer. I gave her the floor. I offered her the rope. Evelyn eagerly took the opportunity to control the official record. She detailed the exact timeline of the dinner. She named the bakery. She confidently stated she served the dessert on clean plates using a freshly washed silver knife. She looked the doctor directly in the eye and stated she took every possible precaution to protect her precious grandson. She documented her lie on an official medical record. Every word she spoke was a deliberate fabrication recorded by a medical professional. Mark nodded along, validating her story. The doctor accepted the narrative of an unfortunate bakery cross-contamination, saving us from a grueling police interrogation right there in the emergency room. While she spoke, I replayed the high-definition footage in my mind. I saw the casual hum of her holiday music. I saw the deliberate twist of the plastic lid. I saw the thick scoop of the peanut butter. I saw the meticulous spreading of the toxin under the vanilla frosting on the exact corner piece designated for Leo. She was constructing a towering, fragile monument of deceit right in front of me. I realized that if I confronted her now, in this private room with only Mark as a witness, she would find a way to manipulate the outcome. She would claim she thought the jar contained a safe sunflower seed alternative. She would minimize the intent. She would twist the narrative until Mark believed it was just an unfortunate mix-up by a well-meaning grandmother. To truly stop her, the truth needed a stage. It needed an audience composed of the people she valued most. It needed to be presented in a way that offered zero room for negotiation, debate, or gaslighting. As the doctor finalized the discharge paperwork, a plan crystallized in my mind with cold clarity. I would not fight her tonight. I would give her a false sense of security. I would let her believe she had won the battle so I could secure the ultimate victory on my own terms. I stood up, smoothed the front of my shirt, and looked at Mark. I offered a soft, defeated nod. I told him we should host a small gathering at our house tomorrow evening. I said we needed to put this terrible misunderstanding behind us and celebrate the fact that Leo was safe. Mark let out a long breath, his shoulders dropping in profound relief. He thought I was surrendering. Evelyn offered me a tight, magnanimous smile, victorious in her delusion. They had no idea they had just accepted an invitation to their own trial. The emergency room doors slid shut, sealing the corridor in a heavy, unnatural quiet. Mark had offered to drive his mother back to her suburban estate. He claimed she was too fragile to navigate the icy roads alone. He kissed my forehead, a brief, hollow gesture, and promised to return as soon as she was settled. I watched him walk away. His posture hunched forward, carrying the weight of a manufactured tragedy while his actual child lay attached to a heart monitor 20 feet behind me. Once I was alone in the dimly lit observation room, the adrenaline that had kept me standing for the past 4 hours finally evaporated. I collapsed into the hard plastic chair. I pressed my hands over my face and the dam broke. My chest heaved with violent, silent sobs. I tasted salt on my lips. I was shaking so hard my teeth rattled against each other. My little boy had turned blue on my living room floor. He had looked at me with pure terror in his eyes while he gasped for air. I wrapped my arms tightly around my own stomach, bending forward, physically sick from the phantom image of him suffocating. I sat there in the dark, a shattered mother mourning the safety she thought she had built for her child. It took 10 agonizing minutes for the physical shaking to subside. I wiped my wet face with the sleeve of my cardigan. I took a deep, jagged breath, forcing the stale hospital air down into my lungs. The terrifying vulnerability was still there, but beneath it, a tiny, white-hot spark of rage began to catch fire. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket. My hands were still trembling slightly as the screen glowed against the dark fabric of my jeans. The digital clock read 2 in the morning. I swallowed the thick lump in my throat, wiped a rogue tear from the glass screen with my thumb, and opened the security application. The existence of the camera was a bitter irony. 3 weeks prior, I had hired a local college student to watch Leo for a few hours on Tuesday afternoons. Mark, who rarely questioned the safety of his mother's antique-filled home, suddenly developed a severe case of parental anxiety regarding a stranger. He insisted we purchase a discreet surveillance device. He spent $100 on a high-definition, motion-activated lens. I tucked it into the foliage of a money tree on our kitchen counter. When we packed our bags for the holiday weekend at Evelyn's house, I tossed the small black cube into my overnight bag, planning to place it in a guest room where Leo would be sleeping. Upon arriving, I realized the guest room lacked a clear vantage point. I carried the device downstairs and set it on the marble counter in Evelyn's massive kitchen. I hid it behind a row of heavy, unread culinary encyclopedias. I forgot about it the moment the dinner guests began to arrive. Now, sitting in the sterile quiet of the hospital, I tapped the cloud storage icon. The application loaded, displaying a grid of thumbnail images. I scrolled past the clips of the catering staff carrying trays of appetizers. I moved backward through the timeline, searching for the hour before the guests arrived. I needed the specific window of time when Evelyn insisted on being alone in the kitchen to prepare the dessert presentation. I found a clip time stamped at 4:15 in the afternoon. I pressed play. The screen filled with crisp, colorful footage. The microphone picked up the ambient sound with chilling clarity. Evelyn stood alone at the center island. She wore a thick apron over her burgundy dress to protect the expensive fabric. A holiday choir sang softly from a smart speaker on the windowsill. She was humming along, her shoulders swaying slightly to the rhythm. She looked relaxed. She looked happy. The 3-tiered cake sat on a silver platter directly in front of her. The white vanilla frosting was flawless. I watched as she walked to the walk-in pantry. She emerged holding a jar with a familiar red, blue, and green label. It was a standard, store-bought jar of creamy peanut butter. She set the jar on the marble counter with a dull thud. She opened a drawer and retrieved a small icing spatula. My breath caught in my throat. I stopped blinking. I stared at the small screen, my mind begging the image to be a misunderstanding. Perhaps she was making a separate snack. Perhaps she was preparing a different dish. She unscrewed the plastic lid. She dipped the metal spatula into the jar and pulled out a thick, heavy scoop of the paste. She walked back to the cake. She did not mix the peanut butter into the main body of the dessert. She did not spread it randomly. She moved to the bottom tier, focusing entirely on the exact front corner. She carefully lifted a section of the white vanilla rosettes. She scraped the peanut butter underneath the decorative icing, hiding it deep within the layers of the sponge cake. She smoothed the top back into place, concealing her work with the precision of a surgeon. That corner piece was a known entity in our family. For 2 years, Evelyn had made a grand show of cutting that specific, heavily frosted corner piece and presenting it to Leo. She always claimed it was the special slice reserved for the youngest guest. Tonight, she had laced his designated portion with a lethal allergen. She screwed the lid back onto the jar, wiped the spatula clean with a paper towel, and tossed the towel into the trash can. She picked up her wine glass, took a sip, and continued humming. The video ended. I sat in the hard plastic chair, feeling the chill of the room settle into my bones. The narrative Mark had been selling me for half a decade shattered into dust. This was not a generational gap. This was not a stubborn grandmother refusing to understand modern medical science. This was a deliberate, calculated trap. She wanted to trigger a mild reaction. She wanted Leo to break out in hives so she could point her finger at me, label me a dramatic liar, and prove that her robust genetics were superior to my working-class bloodline. She lacked the basic empathy to realize a Class 6 allergy does not produce a mild rash. She gambled my son's life to win a petty argument about a dessert. An hour later, the heavy wooden door pushed open. Mark walked in holding 2 paper cups of cafeteria coffee. He looked exhausted. He handed me a cup and slumped into the chair beside mine. He let out a long, ragged sigh, rubbing his hands over his face. He told me his mother was devastated. He said she cried the entire drive home. He explained that she was so shaken by the ordeal she had to take a sedative just to fall asleep. He leaned closer to me, his voice dropping to a soft, pleading whisper. He said that once Leo was discharged, it would go a long way if I called her and apologized for causing a scene at the dinner table. He said she felt attacked by my sudden rush to grab the medical bag. He wanted me to smooth the waters. I looked at the man I married. I looked at the dark circles under his eyes and the desperate need for his mother's approval etched into his posture. He was asking me to comfort the architect of our son's near-fatal collapse. I did not argue. I did not show him the digital file glowing in my pocket. Arguing with Mark would only give him time to warn her. He would panic. He would try to mediate. He would attempt to explain away the video, claiming she made a mistake and forgot which piece belonged to Leo. I took a slow sip of the terrible coffee. I looked him directly in the eye and offered a thin, calm smile. I told him he was right. I told him we needed to handle this as a family. I reiterated my plan to host everyone at our house the following evening for a proper, peaceful dinner. I promised him I would make sure everything was set right. Mark relaxed. He reached out and squeezed my hand, thanking me for being reasonable. He had no idea the woman sitting next to him had just transformed from a compromising wife into a financial auditor preparing an airtight indictment. As the morning sun began to creep through the hospital blinds, I drafted a quick, precise email to a colleague whose husband worked in family law. The trap was set. Now I just needed to prepare the venue. Leo was discharged at 10 o'clock the next morning. The doctor gave us a fresh set of epinephrine injectors and a lecture on vigilance. Mark carried our son to the car, wrapping him in a heavy wool blanket to shield him from the biting winter wind. I drove us back to our neighborhood. The quiet streets were lined with modest houses, quite a departure from the towering brick facades of Evelyn's gated community. As soon as we walked through the front door, Mark settled Leo onto the living room sofa and turned on a cartoon. Mark then retreated to his home office, claiming he needed to answer some urgent emails he had ignored during the crisis. The reality was that he needed to retreat. He wanted to burrow into a spreadsheet and pretend the near-fatal event of the previous night was just a minor hiccup. He wanted the machinery of his life to return to its factory settings. I did not have that luxury. The moment his office door clicked shut, I pulled my laptop from my work bag and opened my personal email. The message from my colleague was waiting for me. It contained the contact information for David Miller, a senior partner at a reputable family law firm downtown. I dialed his emergency holiday line immediately. I explained the situation with the dry, precise tone I used to report accounting errors. I told him I had high-definition video evidence of my mother-in-law intentionally contaminating my child's food with a lethal allergen. I forwarded the digital file directly to a secure server. 15 minutes later, David called me back. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He said the footage was devastating. He explained that while the family courts were closed for Christmas, we could strike the match immediately. He instructed me to file a police report for reckless endangerment using their online portal to secure an official case number. By noon, he had drafted a comprehensive notice of intent to file for an emergency restraining order, attaching the police report number and a still frame from the video. I paid a courier to deliver the heavy, watermarked document to my house. I spent the afternoon preparing the battlefield. I am not the kind of woman who throws plates or screams insults. My entire professional life is governed by structure, sequence, and undeniable proof. If an executive tries to hide a six-figure loss in a phantom account, I do not yell at him. I simply hand the board of directors the ledger. I intended to treat Evelyn exactly like a fraudulent executive. I cleaned the kitchen counters until they gleam. I prepared a simple but elegant dinner, roasting a chicken and assembling a large salad. I set the dining table with our best dishes, placing the silverware in perfect alignment. I wanted the environment to feel serene. I wanted Evelyn to walk into my house and feel completely comfortable, lulled into the belief that she remained the undisputed matriarch of our extended family. At 3 o'clock, the doorbell rang. It was the courier. I signed for the heavy cardboard envelope. Inside was a crisp, legal document printed on the heavy bond paper of David Miller's law firm. It was a formal notice of intent, detailing the criminal code for child endangerment and outlining the emergency protective order that would be filed the second the courthouse doors unlocked on Monday morning. It included the official police case number I had secured hours earlier. I slipped the document back into the envelope and placed it on the sideboard in the dining room, right next to the stack of dessert plates. Then I tackled the final, most crucial piece of the strategy. Our living room is dominated by a 75-inch smart television mounted above the fireplace. Mark bought it last year to watch football. I grabbed the remote control and navigated to the screen mirroring function. I synced my phone to the television. I pulled up the video file of Evelyn in her kitchen. I tested the connection twice. The image of her standing at the marble island holding the peanut butter jar stretched across the massive screen with terrifying clarity. The audio of her humming the holiday tune filled the room. I paused the video precisely at the 0-second mark. I switched the television input back to a static landscape image, leaving the application running silently in the background. The trap was armed. At 5 o'clock, Mark emerged from his office. He looked at the set table and the roasting chicken. He offered a relieved smile, genuinely believing I was putting in the effort to mend fences with his mother. He told me he appreciated my willingness to be the bigger person. He said his sisters, Chloe and Jessica, were also coming. He explained they wanted to offer their support after the scare at the hospital. Chloe and Jessica are younger copies of Evelyn. They wear the same expensive brands, share the same country club memberships, and echo the same condescending opinions. They have always treated me like a temporary intern in their family corporation. Having them present was actually a stroke of luck. Evelyn cared deeply about her public image, but she cared most about how her daughters perceived her. They were her primary audience, her loyal audience. Destroying her narrative in front of them would sever her power source completely. I told Mark I was glad they were coming. I told him it was important for the whole family to be on the same page moving forward. At exactly 6 o'clock, the headlights of 2 luxury vehicles swept across our front windows. The heavy thud of car doors slamming echoed in the quiet street. The players were arriving. I smoothed the front of my shirt, took a deep breath, and walked to the front door to welcome them in. I was ready to balance the ledger. The doorbell chimed, a sharp, cheerful sound that cut through the quiet anticipation in my hallway. I pulled the heavy oak door open, letting in a gust of freezing December wind. Evelyn stood on the welcome mat. She wore a tailored camel coat and a silk scarf draped perfectly over her shoulders. Behind her stood her 2 daughters, Chloe and Jessica, flanking her like loyal sentinels in matching designer winter wear. Evelyn did not wait for an invitation. She swept past me, her leather boots clicking against the hardwood floor. She carried 3 large, glossy shopping bags from a high-end department store. The thick paper rustled loudly as she made her way straight into the living room. Chloe and Jessica followed close behind. To understand the dynamic of this trio is to understand a masterclass in conditional affection. Chloe is 3 years older than Mark. She married a corporate lawyer and spends her days managing a pristine image on social media. Jessica is the youngest, a luxury real estate agent who relies entirely on Evelyn's country club connections to secure her listings. Neither sister has ever formed an opinion that their mother did not authorize first. They survive by agreeing with the matriarch. Tonight, their assignment was to validate the victimhood of the woman who had supposedly endured a terrible trauma. Evelyn spotted Leo sitting on the sofa. He was watching his cartoon, still looking pale but breathing easily. She dropped her shopping bags onto the glass coffee table with a dramatic thud. She rushed over, dropping to her knees beside the couch. She reached out and cupped his face in her manicured hands. She pitched her voice an octave higher, adopting a tone of fragile, overwhelming relief. She told him how brave he was. She said her heart nearly stopped beating when she saw him struggling the night before. She kissed his forehead and promised him that Grandma would never let those careless bakery workers hurt him again. Leo just blinked at her. He shifted uncomfortably and turned his eyes back to the television screen. Children possess an instinct for authenticity that adults often learn to ignore. He did not lean into her embrace. He merely tolerated it. Having performed the necessary display of grandmotherly devotion, Evelyn stood up and turned her attention to her primary audience. Chloe and Jessica were already nodding in sympathy. Evelyn placed a hand over her chest and let out a long, ragged sigh. She began her rehearsed monologue. She told her daughters she had not slept a single minute. She described the anxiety of sitting in her large, empty house, terrified that the phone might ring with bad news. She detailed how she had already called the manager of the local bakery to demand a full investigation into their sanitation practices. She painted a vivid picture of negligent hourly employees who lacked the basic human decency to respect a severe allergy. Chloe stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Evelyn. She glared in my direction and stated that people today simply do not care about quality control. Jessica chimed in, suggesting they should file a civil lawsuit against the establishment for emotional distress. They were building a fortress of lies, brick by brick, right in the center of my home. I stood by the kitchen island, observing the performance. I did not interrupt. I uncorked a bottle of red wine and began pouring it into crystal glasses. Mark walked out of his office, drawn by the sound of the voices. He saw his mother holding court, surrounded by his sisters. He saw the expensive shopping bags resting on the table. Evelyn reached into the largest bag and pulled out a stack of wrapped boxes. She handed a delicate ribbon-tied package to Chloe, another to Jessica, and a heavy rectangular box to Mark. She claimed she bought them as a celebration of life, a token to remind them all of how precious their time together truly was. Mark looked down at the gift. The tension in his shoulders melted away. He walked over to the kitchen island, stopping beside me. He picked up 2 glasses of wine. He leaned in close, the scent of his aftershave mixing with the aroma of the roasted chicken. He kept his voice low, a conspiratorial whisper meant only for me. He pointed out how devastated she looked under the surface. He noted the dark circles she had intentionally left uncovered by makeup. He told me to look at how much she loved our son. He squeezed my arm and begged me to let go of any lingering resentment about the emergency room. He wanted me to recognize her effort and reward her with my submission. I took the glass of wine from his hand. I looked at the woman standing 10 feet away, accepting the adoration of her daughters. The contrast was staggering. Exactly 24 hours ago, that exact same woman stood in her pristine kitchen humming a cheerful holiday tune and deliberately folded a lethal dose of peanut butter into a slice of vanilla cake. Now, she was handing out expensive gifts and accepting sympathy for the very crisis she engineered. I gave Mark a slow, deliberate nod. I told him he had nothing to worry about tonight. I promised him the air would be cleared before the evening was over. I stepped away from the counter and called everyone to the dining room. The transition was seamless. Evelyn took the seat at the far end of the long wooden table, the position traditionally reserved for the head of the household. I did not correct her. I took my seat near the middle, with my back to the living room and the large, dark television screen resting above the fireplace. Mark sat directly across from me. Chloe and Jessica filled out the remaining chairs, still murmuring their support for their mother. I served the salad. I brought out the roasted chicken and the side dishes. The clinking of silver forks against porcelain plates filled the room. The conversation flowed easily at first. Chloe complained about the logistics of her upcoming ski trip to Aspen. Jessica boasted about a high-value property she just listed near the lake. Mark nodded along, happy to be back in the familiar, predictable rhythm of his family. I ate in silence. I tracked the flow of the dialogue, waiting for the inevitable shift. Evelyn cannot tolerate being out of the spotlight for long. She needed to bring the focus back to her manufactured trauma. She needed to secure her victory. As I stood up to clear the dinner plate, she made her move. She picked up her crystal wine glass. She held it by the stem, raising it slightly into the air. She reached out with her other hand and tapped her silver fork against the delicate rim. A sharp, clear ringing sound echoed through the dining room. The casual chatter stopped instantly. Chloe set down her napkin. Jessica leaned forward, giving her mother her undivided attention. Mark offered a soft, encouraging smile. Evelyn cleared her throat. She looked around the table, her gaze lingering on each of her children before finally settling on me. The patronizing smirk I had seen in the hospital waiting room returned, playing at the corners of her mouth. She had an audience. She had her enablers. She believed she held all the power in the room. I placed my hand in my pocket, my fingers brushing against the cold plastic of the television remote control. The time for observation had ended. The transition from the main course to dessert always served as Evelyn's designated time to hold court. Throughout Mark's childhood, this was the hour she used to deliver verdicts on the family. She would announce who had pleased her that week and who had fallen short, disguising her judgments as helpful advice or maternal concern. She demanded total silence and rapt attention. If a child fidgeted, they were excused from the table. If a husband interrupted, he was met with a freezing glare that could last for days. Tonight, I cleared the dinner plates and returned from the kitchen carrying a platter of sliced melon and a bowl of safe, prepackaged sugar cookies. I placed the dessert in the center of the table. I poured fresh coffee into their cups. The stage was set exactly as she preferred it. The audience was fed, comfortable, and compliant. Evelyn waited until I took my seat. She picked up her crystal wine glass by the delicate stem. She reached out with her other hand and tapped her silver fork against the rim. A sharp, clear note rang through the dining room, cutting through the low murmur of conversation. The casual chatter died instantly. Chloe folded her napkin and placed it on her lap. Jessica leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand, giving her mother her undivided attention. Mark offered a soft, encouraging smile, signaling his readiness to receive whatever wisdom she prepared to dispense. Evelyn cleared her throat. She looked around the table, her gaze lingering on her daughters before finally settling on me. She stood up slowly, smoothing the front of her camel-colored dress. She adopted a posture of weary grace, playing the role of a survivor who had weathered a terrible storm and emerged stronger, ready to forgive those who had wronged her. She began her speech with a heavy sigh. She thanked everyone for gathering. She said families must stick together when tragedies strike, even when those tragedies are born of misunderstandings. She spoke about the terrifying incident at the hospital, framing it as a collective trauma that she, specifically, had endured. Then, she executed the pivot. The subtle shift from victim to benevolent judge. She looked directly into my eyes. She pitched her voice into a tone of synthetic dripping sympathy. She said she understood how the anxieties of modern motherhood could cloud a person's judgment. She suggested that when a mother is constantly reading internet forums and worrying about invisible dangers, she might start seeing threats where none exist. She told the room that paranoia often leads to hysteria. She actually used the word hysteria. She raised her glass a fraction of an inch higher. She announced that she was choosing to overlook the disrespect I showed her the night before. She said she knew I panicked when I grabbed the medical bag and caused a scene in front of her affluent neighbors. She told the table that we must all learn to extend grace, to forgive minor errors in judgment, and to stop looking for someone to blame when accidents happen. The room digested her words. Chloe nodded slowly, wiping an imaginary tear from the corner of her eye. Jessica murmured her agreement, taking a sip of her wine. I looked at Mark. This was his final opportunity. His mother was sitting at our dining table, openly calling his wife crazy, hysterical, and paranoid. She was rewriting the narrative of his son nearly suffocating to death, turning it into a story about my mental instability. I waited for him to speak. I waited for him to defend the reality we both witnessed. Mark looked at me across the table. His eyes were wide and pleading. He gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. He wanted me to accept the olive branch. He wanted me to swallow the insult, say thank you, and let his mother claim the moral ground. His silence was a transaction. He was trading my dignity for his comfort. I picked up my silver salad fork from the table. I held it for a fraction of a second. Then I dropped it onto my empty porcelain dessert plate. The sound was a harsh metallic crack that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. Chloe jumped in her seat. Evelyn stopped smiling. The patronizing warmth vanished from her face, replaced by a flash of genuine irritation at having her monologue interrupted. I leaned forward. I rested my forearms on the table. I did not raise my voice. I spoke slowly, ensuring every single syllable carried the weight of a judge reading a verdict. I asked her to clarify her statement. I asked her what specific minor errors we were supposed to forgive. I asked if we should forgive the supposed mistake made by the teenage cashier at the bakery. Or, I suggested, perhaps we should forgive the mistake that originated from the plastic jar of Jif brand peanut butter sitting on the marble island in her pristine kitchen. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. It was the kind of quiet that precedes a structural collapse. Evelyn froze. The color drained from her face, leaving her pale beneath her expensive foundation. Her eyes darted rapidly from side to side, processing the specific detail I had just dropped onto the table. The mention of the brand name stripped away her plausible deniability. She knew I had a piece of information I was never supposed to possess. But Evelyn had spent 40 years perfecting the art of denial. The panic lasted for only a heartbeat before she replaced it with a mask of pure, unadulterated outrage. She slammed her wine glass down onto the table. Wine sloshed over the rim, staining the white linen tablecloth. She pointed a trembling finger at me. Her voice shook with manufactured fury. She demanded to know what on earth I was talking about. She asked, how dare I speak to her that way in front of her children? She looked around the table, rallying her troops, playing the bewildered and deeply offended elder. She turned her gaze to her son. She ordered Mark to look at the woman he married. She demanded he take control of his household. She told him I was having a mental breakdown and accusing her of trying to poison her own flesh and blood. The command activated decades of deep psychological conditioning in my husband. Mark did not immediately explode. He flinched. He looked at his mother, seeing the absolute fury in her eyes, and then looked back at me. A bead of sweat formed at his temple, catching the light of the dining room chandelier. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly in his throat. He leaned forward across the table, keeping his voice to a desperate, shaking whisper. He begged me to just let it go. He pleaded with me to stop talking and apologize before things escalated further. He reached out, his hand hovering over the table, trying to coax me back into quiet submission. I did not take his hand. I just stared at him. The rejection was the final catalyst. Evelyn let out a sharp, impatient scoff, her glare demanding his total obedience. Under the crushing weight of her disappointment, the gentle, pleading husband vanished. He was replaced by a cornered animal, desperate to appease its master. Mark reacted on pure panic. He pushed his chair back so hard it scraped violently against the hardwood floor. He stood up, his face flushing a deep, angry red. He gripped the edge of the table. He leaned toward me, his voice finally breaking into a harsh, loud bark. He told me I was going too far. He said I was ruining the dinner and disrespecting his family. He demanded I apologize to his mother immediately, or pack a bag and leave the house so they could enjoy the rest of the evening in peace. He drew his line in the sand. He chose his side. I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear. I did not stand up to match his energy. I remained seated, perfectly still, watching the chaotic collapse of the men and women who thought they could dictate my reality. I reached my right hand into the pocket of my cardigan. My fingers wrapped around the smooth, black plastic of the television remote control. I pulled it out and set it on the table right next to my coffee cup. I looked up at my husband, then shifted my gaze to his mother. I raised my hand, extended one finger, and pressed the center button. The single press of a button sent a silent signal across the room. The massive television mounted above the fireplace woke from its dormant state. The screen flickered, casting a bright, cold digital light that washed over the warm tones of the dining room. Before the image fully materialized, the audio filled the space. It was the cheerful, lilting melody of a classic holiday carol, hummed in a distinct, recognizable soprano. It was not a recording of a famous singer. It was the voice of the woman sitting at the head of my table. Evelyn stopped mid-breath. The righteous indignation froze on her face. Her patronizing smile vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp confusion. She snapped her head toward the living room. Every pair of eyes at the table followed her gaze. The display offered a crisp, high-resolution window into the previous afternoon. The camera angle provided a perfect, unobstructed view of Evelyn sitting in the center of her sprawling, opulent kitchen. There she was, wearing a thick canvas apron over her expensive burgundy dress to protect the silk. She swayed her hips slightly to the rhythm of her own humming. She looked entirely relaxed. She looked like a woman in her natural element, commanding her domain without a care in the world. She walked over to her walk-in pantry and emerged holding a plastic jar. The red, blue, and green label was unmistakable. Nobody spoke. The clinking of silverware ceased. The room fell into a suffocating quiet, save for the cheerful humming echoing from the speakers. On the screen, Evelyn unscrewed the lid. She reached into a drawer and retrieved a metal icing spatula. She dipped the tool into the jar and pulled out a thick, heavy scoop of peanut butter. She walked over to the three-tiered cake resting on a silver platter. She moved directly to the bottom tier, focusing her attention on the front right corner. She carefully lifted a section of the white vanilla rosettes. She scraped the paste underneath the decorative icing, hiding the lethal ingredient deep within the layers of the sponge cake. She meticulously smoothed the top back into place, concealing her work with the practiced precision of a surgeon. She screwed the lid back onto the jar, wiped the spatula clean with a paper towel, tossed the towel into the trash can, picked up her wine glass, and took a casual sip. The video ended. The screen faded to black, leaving the dining room bathed in the dim light of the chandelier. The silence that followed was profound. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum that pulled all the oxygen from the room. Chloe was the first to break the physical stillness. Her fingers went slack. The crystal wine glass slipped from her grasp and hit the hardwood floor with a sharp, violent crash. Shards of thin glass scattered across the polished oak. Dark red liquid splashed against the white baseboards, pooling like a fresh wound. She did not look down at the mess. She kept her eyes glued to the dark reflection of the television screen. Jessica brought both hands up to her face, pressing her palms tightly against her mouth to stifle a raw, guttural gasp. She pushed her chair backward. The wooden legs scraped harshly against the floor. She was physically retreating from the woman she had idolized her entire life. These two sisters had spent decades adopting their mother's prejudices, defending her cruelties, and mirroring her condescending worldview. They believed their mother was strict but fundamentally righteous. that belief evaporated in the span of 2 minutes. They were staring at a stranger. Mark stood frozen. The cognitive dissonance was tearing him apart from the inside out. Since childhood, Mark had been conditioned to view his mother as the ultimate authority on truth. If she said the sky was green, he would adjust his own vision to see the hue. If she said a medical emergency was a lie, he would doubt the doctors. He had built his entire personality around being the compliant, peacemaking son. Now, the high-definition footage stripped away his ability to mediate. There was no middle ground to seek. There was no misunderstanding to smooth over. He watched his mother orchestrate a biological attack on his 5-year-old child. His chest heaved. The flush of anger that had colored his cheeks only moments before drained away, leaving his skin looking sickly and pale. He turned his head slowly, looking from the black screen to the woman sitting at the head of the table. His voice lacked any trace of the confident husband who had just ordered me to apologize. It was barely a whisper, yet it sounded deafening in the quiet room. He asked her what she had done. Evelyn panicked. The cornerstone of her power was her ability to control the narrative. She relied on rewriting history and playing the victim. But you cannot gaslight a time-stamped video file. You cannot rewrite a digital recording that leaves zero room for interpretation. The undeniable proof acted like acid, burning right through her polished exterior. Her jaw trembled. She gripped the edges of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. She looked at Chloe, then at Jessica, searching for her loyal soldiers to jump to her defense. They refused to meet her eyes. She was entirely exposed. She stammered. Her voice cracked, stripping away the refined cadence she usually projected. She pointed a shaking finger at the television. She claimed she only wanted to prove I was lying. She spat out the words, her desperation bleeding into viciousness. She said the boy could not possibly be that fragile. She argued that she was trying to build his immunity, claiming I was keeping him weak on purpose to control the family dynamic. She tried to frame her premeditated poisoning as a tough love parenting lesson. She looked at Mark, her eyes wide and pleading. She begged him to understand her perspective. She told him I was trying to tear their family apart with my hidden cameras and my sneaky, underhanded tactics. She tried to run her classic play, attacking the method of her exposure to distract from the crime itself. She wanted him to focus on the camera, not the peanut butter. I did not let her finish the thought. I did not give her the space to spin another thread of manipulation. I stood up from my chair. My movements were slow, deliberate, and unbothered by her frantic energy. I walked over to the sideboard where the heavy cardboard envelope rested next to the dessert plates. I pulled out the fixed stack of medical records the hospital had provided upon our discharge. I walked back to the table and threw the papers down. They landed with a heavy, authoritative thud right in front of her empty plate. The top page featured a bright red sticker marking an anaphylactic event. I looked down at her. I kept my voice cold, steady, and devoid of any emotional vulnerabilities she could exploit. I told her she did not prove a parenting theory. I told her she triggered a Class 6 respiratory failure. I told her she almost killed him. The blunt force of the word killed hung over the table. Evelyn shrank back into her chair. The regal posture collapsed. She looked small, old, and terrified. She had pushed her boundaries 1 inch too far, and she had finally found the edge of a cliff. She began to cry, but these were not the delicate theatrical tears she shed in the hospital waiting room. These were the ugly, desperate tears of a tyrant, realizing her empire had just fallen. She reached her hand out toward Mark, begging him to say something, pleading with him to protect her from the consequences of her own actions. But the medical records were just the preamble. The true consequence was still waiting inside the envelope on the sideboard. The echo of that single accusation hung over the dining table, heavy and undeniable. Evelyn continued to weep, her hands covering her face, projecting a pathetic image of a misunderstood elder. She waited for someone to comfort her. She waited for the familiar rush of family members scrambling to mend her bruised ego and reassure her of her elevated status. No one moved. I turned my back on her tears. I walked away from the table, my footsteps steady and measured against the hardwood floor. I approached the oak sideboard. The heavy cardboard envelope rested exactly where I had placed it hours earlier, right beside a stack of delicate dessert plates we would never use. I picked it up. The rough texture of the thick paper felt grounding against my fingertips. I pulled the tab, tearing the cardboard open. The harsh sound of the rip cut straight through the noise of Evelyn's sobbing. I reached inside and extracted a thick stack of legal-sized paper. The top sheet bore the official embossed seal of the county court and the unmistakable blue ink signature of a sitting judge. I walked back to my chair. I did not sit down. I stood tall, holding the document in my right hand. I looked down at the woman who had spent half a decade treating me like an uninvited guest in my own marriage. I tossed the papers onto the table. They slid across the polished wood, stopping mere inches from her trembling fingers. The bold black text at the top of the page read, "Emergency Order of Protection." Evelyn stared at the paper. She did not attempt to pick it up. Her hands remained curled tightly near her chest. I broke the silence, my voice devoid of any warmth, anger, or hesitation. I was simply an auditor delivering the final balance sheet. I informed her that she was looking at a formal notice of intent drafted by one of the most ruthless family law attorneys in the city. I explained that it detailed the exact emergency protective order that would be filed the second the courthouse opened on Monday morning. I told her that the document demanded she stay 300 feet away from my son and myself and prohibited her from contacting us through any medium. I let that reality sink into the room, watching the color drain further from her face. Then I delivered the final, devastating piece of the strategy. I tapped the bold case number printed at the top of the page. I told her I had already filed an official report with the local police precinct that morning. The authorities already held a copy of the high-definition video footage on their secure servers, officially logged as primary evidence for a pending criminal investigation into child endangerment. The mention of law enforcement acted like a physical blow. Evelyn gasped, her breath catching painfully in her throat. The facade of the misunderstood grandmother shattered entirely, replaced by the raw, unfiltered terror of a woman facing actual, undeniable consequences for the first time in her privileged life. She turned her head toward her daughters. She reached out, her fingers grasping at the empty air, pleading with Chloe and Jessica to intervene. She asked them to tell me this was a massive overreaction. She begged them to fix it. The response she received was a masterclass in self-preservation. Chloe, the woman who spent her life curating a flawless social image, took a deliberate step backward. Her husband was a partner at a prestigious corporate law firm. A public scandal involving the intentional poisoning of a child would contaminate their reputation and their livelihoods overnight. Jessica mirrored the retreat. Her luxury real estate business relied heavily on the very country club gossip network that would soon feast on her mother's spectacular downfall. The sisters looked at the legal document resting on the table, then looked at the dark television screen still looming in the living room. They did not offer a single word of comfort. They grabbed their designer coats from the back of their chairs. They moved toward the hallway in unison, abandoning the sinking ship without a backward glance. The heavy oak front door opened and closed, sealing their departure. With her loyal audience fleeing the scene, Evelyn was left isolated at the head of the table, her power stripped away in a matter of minutes. I turned my attention away from her and focused entirely on the man sitting across from me. Venomous snake. His chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths. The two governing forces of his existence had collided in a catastrophic impact, leaving him stranded in the wreckage. I looked at my husband. I did not feel anger toward him in that specific moment. I only felt a cold, profound pity. I spoke his name, forcing his gaze away from the table and up to my face. I told him he had exactly 5 seconds to make a permanent decision. I pointed toward the front door. I told him he could pack a bag, escort his mother out of my house, and spend the rest of his life managing her manufactured crises and defending her cruelty. Or, I said, he could sit in that chair, accept the reality of what she did to his son, and help me build a firewall to protect our family. He had to choose between his DNA and the life he chose to build with me. There was no negotiation. There was no middle ground to seek. The era of keeping the peace was dead. The silence in the dining room became deafening. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked away the seconds. 1, 2, 3. Mark opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at his mother, who was now sobbing into her hands, a broken and pathetic figure. He looked back at me, his eyes begging for an extension, begging for an easy way out of the trap he had allowed her to set over the last 5 years. 4, 5. The time expired. He did not stand up. He did not tell her to leave. He just sat there, paralyzed by his lifelong conditioning. He chose the path of least resistance through sheer inaction. His inability to choose was the loudest, most definitive answer he could have possibly provided. A marriage cannot survive on cowardice. A father cannot protect his child if he is too afraid to confront the threat. I gave him a slow, final nod, accepting his verdict. I did not scream. I did not throw the rest of the dinner in the trash. I simply turned on my heel and walked out of the dining room. I walked into the living room where Leo was still sitting on the sofa, watching the bright colors of the television screen, oblivious to the collapse of his father's family. I picked up my son. He wrapped his small arms around my neck, resting his head on my shoulder. I grabbed my heavy winter coat, my purse, and my car keys from the hook by the door. I walked out into the freezing winter night, leaving my husband sitting at a table with his toxic mother, surrounded by the ruins of the life they had just dismantled together. I drove to a corporate hotel 2 towns over. The heater in my sedan blasted warm air, melting the frost off the windshield, but my hands remained numb, gripping the leather steering wheel. Leo fell asleep in his car seat before we even reached the highway on-ramp. He did not ask where his father was. Children possess a profound instinct for safety long before they develop the vocabulary to articulate it. He knew the tension had broken. I carried him up to the 3rd floor, laid him on the crisp white sheets of the hotel bed, and watched his chest rise and fall in a steady, unbroken rhythm. For the first time in 5 years, the air around us felt clean. The next morning, the legal machinery I had set in motion began to grind Evelyn's pristine empire into dust. The criminal investigation moved swiftly, but I did not wait for the detectives to tell me why she did it. I am a financial auditor. When people commit unthinkable acts, I follow the money. The morning I called my attorney, I had his firm pull the recent public filings for the family trust. The ledger revealed a chilling financial conspiracy. My father-in-law had recently restructured the trust, designating Mark as the primary trustee for Leo's portion with generous provisions for housing and daily care. Evelyn knew she could not touch that money directly, but she controlled her son. She orchestrated the medical scare to paint me as an unfit, hysterical mother, forcing Mark to secure full custody. Once Mark was a single father living under her roof, she planned to manipulate him into draining Leo's trust to fund her own lavish lifestyle. She was not trying to win a parenting argument. She was building a puppet regime. She gambled a child's life to safeguard her portfolio. I forwarded this financial audit directly to my father-in-law. Her ambition became the exact instrument of her undoing. The exposure of her financial plotting severed her final lifeline. My father-in-law is a man who values his reputation above all else. He spent 4 decades building a flawless public image in their affluent Westchester community. When the police subpoenaed his wife's records and the details of the investigation leaked, the scandal breached the high walls of their gated neighborhood. He did not stand by her side. He viewed her actions as a catastrophic liability to his legacy. Upon viewing the high-definition footage and reading the preliminary report from the detective, my father-in-law filed for divorce within 48 hours. He did not do anything illegal, like changing the locks on the marital home. Instead, he hired ruthless corporate litigators who understood exactly how to dismantle her legally. They immediately revoked her authorized user status on all of his high-limit credit cards and legally moved his half of the liquid assets into a secure, separate account. His legal team then used the pending criminal investigation for child endangerment to file an emergency motion for exclusive use of their sprawling estate. Facing a looming eviction order from a judge and entirely cut off from the discretionary funds she used to maintain her luxurious facade, the reality of her new life crashed down on her. The local country club board held an emergency meeting and quietly terminated her membership, erasing her social standing overnight. Evelyn packed her designer bags in disgrace and fled the property before the court-martials could formally remove her, banished from the kingdom she had fought so ruthlessly to rule. Mark fared no better. 2 months after I walked out of our dining room, we met in the sterile conference room of my lawyer's office to discuss the dissolution of our marriage. He looked 10 years older. He wore a wrinkled suit and carried a desperate, pleading energy. He sat across the polished mahogany table and tried to sell me a story of shock and confusion. He claimed he froze at the dinner table because the revelation overwhelmed his senses. He begged for a second chance, promising we could move to a different state, far away from the wreckage of his family. He kept using the word we, desperately trying to bridge a canyon that no longer existed. I did not raise my voice. I looked at the man who had traded his son's safety for his own comfort. I told him that courage is not a trait you discover after the battle is already over. I explained that a father's primary duty is to stand between his child and the threat, even when the threat wears cashmere and shares his last name. His failure to protect Leo was not a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a character deficit I could never unsee. The divorce proceeded without contest. The restraining order and the police evidence rendered any custody debate entirely irrelevant. The judge granted me sole physical and legal custody in record time, awarding Mark limited supervised visitation rights in a public facility. Today, Leo and I live in a modest, sunlit townhouse on the edge of the city. There are no hand-painted French ceramics on my shelves, and there are no toxic conditions attached to the love inside these walls. We bake our own treats, we laugh without looking over our shoulders, and we sleep soundly through the night. The space we occupy is smaller, but the peace we hold is immeasurable. I learned the hardest way possible that DNA does not grant a person permission to disrespect your boundaries. You do not owe your sanity to a shared bloodline. If you are currently sitting at a table where your voice is silenced and your concerns are dismissed as dramatic, I want you to remember this story. The truth does not require a loud argument. It only requires irrefutable evidence and the courage to stop accepting apologies for repeated offenses. If my journey out of the shadows resonated with you, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment down below and tell me how you handle toxic in-laws in your own life. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories. Thank you for staying until the end. Your peace is worth the fight. It has been 14 months since I laid that emergency restraining order on my dining room table. The dust has settled, leaving behind a clear, unobstructed view of my new reality. Leo is thriving. He started kindergarten this fall, carrying a lunchbox packed with safe foods and a medical action plan that his teachers respect without hesitation. The silence in my house is no longer the tense, suffocating quiet of anticipating the next insult. It is the steady, grounded rhythm of genuine security. As an auditor, my profession relies on identifying hidden deficits. The most critical audit I ever conducted was on the people sitting at my own dining table. Standing in the aftermath of a dismantled marriage, I walked away with 2 undeniable truths. First, keeping the peace is usually just a negotiation with toxicity. A calm surface purchased with your own dignity or your child's physical safety is merely a delayed catastrophe. Second, a partner's hesitation is a loud and final choice. A spouse who refuses to stand between you and a clear threat is not a partner. They are a liability. If you are currently sitting in a room where your reality is questioned and your boundaries are treated as suggestions, you do not have to play the role they assigned you. Gather your data, balance your ledger, and walk out. The air on the other side of that door is clean. and the peace you find is worth every difficult step. Thank you for sharing this journey with me on Sweet Life Drama. If my experience gave you the courage to draw a hard line, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below and share the most valuable boundary you have set with difficult relatives. I read every single one. Until next time, protect your peace.